Okay, thanks to Steve, thanks to Gabby, and thanks to all of you for coming. I was somewhat circumspect about a conference in the first week of January in Australia, but given the circumstances, there's nowhere to go on holidays anyway, so which is not really a laughing matter, I'm sorry. This video, there's a longer version available on the internet. It went for about 40 minutes. Warren and I are good friends, and we recently tracked down the beginnings of MMT to our conversations and our work in the mid-90s. And at that stage, there was just the two of us. Soon after, Randy came in. He was involved in the same conversation a little bit later, and then a very short time later, he joined the team, and we used to have this joke that, you could count the MMTers on one hand and have some fingers spare. And then, as time passed, Warren was able to use his financial resources to bring other people into the team, younger people, and they became the sort of proponents of the work. And so what we would, and you know, it's now a maturing discipline, if you like. We've been going for 25 years. And so what we thought, and Warren we catch up with each other quite often, given that we live on opposite sides of the world, it's not easy. But Warren comes down every year and we muck around, and we thought we'd just sit in Newcastle last time he came in November and just talk about what we feel has been the process of our work and how it's unfolded. And you'll hear in the video that we have concerns, we have issues, we're sort of like protective parents. And this is just a short little snippet, and the longer version goes on to all the details, but we'll play this first and then I'll talk some more. Here I've got my mate Warren, who's on more or less his annual visit to Australia to come and see us. Although this year we caught up twice, once in Britain.
Yes.
Warren can't make the Adelaide conference. Stephen asked us whether we could just do a brief video to talk a bit about MMT, and there were a lot of birds maybe the beginnings, what we thought about it, or where we think it's going, but just have a bit of a brief chat. And with Warren in town, what better time to do it?
MMT, what did you call it?
Post-MMT.
Post-MMT. Yeah. What's happened is they've lost the notion of this sequence being where it all started. Other things.
One of the problems, I think, and I've written about this and I've said it at MMT conferences, is that in particular jurisdictions, and let's say America in this case, the body of work has become sort of tied up with political considerations.
Yeah.
And once you start doing that, then you're expressing it as a particular political agenda, then there's all sorts of compromises start slipping in.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean by post-MMT. All these compromises are nothing to do with the core body of work.
Right.
Because the core body of work is seen by various people as being politically not salable, or I don't know, their motivation.
Yeah.
And so you start getting statements that are attributed to MMT that aren't core, they're political compromises. Mm-hmm. That's what I meant by post-MMT.
Yeah.
And I think that's a bit of a problem.
Let me say something about the Green New Deal. You know, the first thing you have to determine, is this a positive or a negative productivity shock, right? Because if it's a negative productivity shock, it doesn't mean we can't afford to pay for it. It means we're going to see a drop in how we have defined the standard of living. In other sense, it may go up, but the way we've defined it in terms of consumption and material.
In the current culture, it's...
Yeah. So, if it's a positive productivity shock, fine. But if it's not, there's a pretty severe real cost to this whole thing. And a lot of MMT proponents have been unrealistic about that. It's like, we're going to create millions of new jobs. Well, jobs are a cost. They're an input. They're not a benefit. And so somehow this has gotten translated into a good thing. if we all lawnmowers and we all cut the lawns with scissors, we're going to have all these new jobs. We'll all be better off.
Well,
It's like negative productivity shock is a negative productivity shock.
And the job component of the massive transformation that we're going to have to make if we're going to deal with these emergencies is being expressed as a job guarantee.
Yeah.
And one of the things, the job guarantee is a small part of it.
Yeah.
It's a little buffer stock, typically meant to be very small.
Yeah.
What we're going to need is massive reskilling of people, high-skilled people.
So as a purist, MMT purist, I'll call myself, apolitical, but if there is a need for public service jobs, just hire them in a normal way.
Yeah, and they're going to be high-skilled by the nature of the sort of challenge. They're going to be high-skilled, very highly educated people.
Yeah, and even if they're low-skilled, you just hire them. Even if they're no-skilled, if you want them to work in the public sector, just hire them. As full-time public sector, I have no problem with that. If you
one of the things of this post-MMT is that and I've written it in this way, that you don't want to make the job guarantee to do too much. You can't, it's not a solution to everything.
Yeah, well, I see it as after you've gotten everybody you want in the public sector, once you've used everybody you want, once the public sector is at the right size, now whatever's left, you want to transition them back to the private sector where they came from. Because back to the money story, there was nobody in the public sector in the beginning of the money story, okay? Everybody was in the private sector doing something in a non-monetary society. The tax extracted them into the public sector. Once you're unemployed, you're out of the private sector, so therefore you're only two sectors. You're in the public sector. The public sector hired as many as the unemployed it wanted. It made a mistake. The tax created more unemployed than it wanted. Fine. Work to transition them back, so they'll be useful and productive. If you say, well, they can do things in the public sector, fine, just go hire them. I don't have any problem with that at all. And if it means you hire every last one of them, good, into regular public sector jobs. But the job guarantee is the buffer stock, which is used to transition them back to provide a superior price anchor than using unemployment as a way to transition them back. Today we use unemployment to transition people back. It's the worst possible way to do it.
Yeah, no, we agree on that. 25 years later, we've had
I finally reached retirement age. I'm 70.
I haven't retired yet. I've still got this.
I've got Medicare. I'm on Social Security.
I've got this MMT&GND thing that I want to get together, and
yeah, you're still on.
That's what I'll be doing. Happy birthday, Steve! It's his birthday today or
happy
tomorrow.
Birthday! Yeah.
And Warren.
Sorry, I couldn't be there, but you've got my numbers, my Skype names, anything else. Be happy to discuss anything you want.
Okay, take care.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so there's a much extended conversation there. Steve asked me today, as one of the original founders, to talk in a very introductory way. And so that's what I'm going to do. It may be boring to those that have been following the work for some years, but maybe not. So this is the textbook that came out in March this year, last year. I haven't even realised the year's changed yet. But this is published by the largest textbook publisher in the world, Macmillan. And it's going pretty well at the moment. And it's an MMT from inception book. Typically, heterodox economists will approach the pedagogy challenge by basically presenting the mainstream and then quibbling around the edges with criticisms at the end of each chapter. We don't privilege the mainstream at all because it's what we think is fake knowledge. There's nothing in mainstream macroeconomics that's worth thinking about. And my profession is one of the most disgraceful purveyors of lies in the world, of all the professions. And so what we did from ground up, it's MMT, right from the whole way it's presented all the way through. And the chapters that we do cover, we're aware that we have a responsibility to our students who may go and work in Treasury or some other place, to have a familiarity with the essential concepts of mainstream economics. And so the chapters that are on mainstream economics are in the History of Economic Thought section of the book. And the other thing is the publisher we had a long debate with the publisher about what the title should be, and they had all of these rather elaborate titles about progressiveness and challenge and radical, and it went back and forth for quite a few months. And I just insisted, and it was my veto, I just insisted it be called macroeconomics, because that's what MMT is. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, you'll also hear today, this is George Lakoff's Truth Sandwich, you won't hear me mention mainstream at all after what I've already said. We're not going to go through the myths of mainstream economics and why it's wrong and why MMT is right. Mainstream economics is over. And so the truth sandwich is that I'm not going to privilege the lie by introducing you to any of the framing of mainstream economics. Some preliminary notes, and this may well make some people feel uncomfortable. And it stems directly from the tension that I hope you picked up in the video that we've just played. The tension that the two basic primary founders, back at the beginning, are starting to feel about the way our work is being used or exposited in various areas. And when we were children, we learn a language and we learnt very simple words first, and we've made sounds first, and then we learnt some words, and then over time we start stringing together into sentences which have no grammatical form, and then we learn grammar, and then by the end of 12 years we're somewhat literate if we stay the course. And MMT is an educative agenda. And what we use are very, in the beginning, in the same way we teach our children to mimic single words. What Warren and I and the later proponents use often are what we call simple heuristics. Just simple little abstract models to get some simple point across. And the problem then is that people, for all the right motivations, get very excited, and a lot of people will email me or say to me in person, oh, we had the light bulb moment when we read your work. And that's a brilliant thing when a young child learns their first few sentences. That's their light bulb moment. But then that doesn't empower anybody to go on Twitter or Facebook and express their enthusiasm for what they've just learned as MMT experts, using these simple heuristics that don't really apply once we add complexity of the institution of reality into the narrative. And so what the founders have been concerned about is this sort of spate of debates we see every day on Twitter, these go-nowhere debates where, for all the right reasons, someone's trying to be an MMTer, using simple heuristics, and they're just getting torn apart, and that damages the whole agenda. This is an educative process, and as you'll see, it's a complex process. And so we've just got to walk before we run. We're educators. Education's a very slow burn. And what it is not. If you went to the last MMT conference, which was called the International MMT Conference in New York State last September, you might have been a bit confused as to why you were there. Because I went there and Warren refused to go because there was very little MMT there. There was a lot of very good work on cultural studies, on media studies, on law, and all this stuff. And I don't want anybody leaving the room saying that I've demeaned that work. It's valuable academic scholarship, but it's not MMT. It may derive insights from MMT to give a new perspective on the way they can profess those disciplines, but it's not MMT. MMT is macro. That's why the book was called Macroeconomics, and macroeconomics means something. It's not micro, so people say, oh, you don't care about inequality. Well, of course I care about inequality, but it's not my field. I'm a macroeconomist. You don't care about gender studies. You don't care about race. You don't care about gay studies. Well, of course I care about those things, but it's not MMT. It's a separate area of study, and I'm very happy that people can be informed by that. So that's the preliminary, and that's the sort of tension that was in that video that you'll experience if you care to watch the whole thing. It's the parents being protective of their baby and seeing Warren says it's the sort of ungrateful child syndrome. I don't talk like that. But now the other thing is that it makes no sense to say when we have MMT or when we have an MMT policy implying that MMT is some better regime that we can move to escape this dystopia. Well, MMT is this dystopia. And it's not a regime. There are no MMT policies in particular. And what I mean by that is that what MMT is a way, what I think as being a superior way of understanding the monetary system and the capacity of the currency issuer within that system. It gives you deeper insights into the operations of the economy and the way money and currency works. And, in my view, lifts the veil of ideology because it allows us to understand that when one of our politicians gets up and say, well, we haven't got enough money to do that, you know immediately they're lying. And so if everybody in Australia gains a MMT understanding, is the way I express it, then our political debate will reach a higher level of quality because we won't tolerate those lies any longer. We won't be induced into that sort of fictional world that my profession unfortunately perpetuates. Now, when I said there's no policy in MMT, what I'm saying is that, let's use crude continuum, a person on the right and a person on the left can reach an MMT understanding. And indeed, I've just come back from Japan where I was speaking and presenting and consulting with the Liberal Democratic Party. They're conservatives on the right, almost nationalists. But they've got an MMT understanding. And so what you have to do to then generate a policy agenda is you have to overlay that understanding with your value system, your ideology. And so a progressive like me on the left will have a completely different policy agenda emerging out of my MMT understanding than a person on the right. But we'll both share the same knowledge about the way the monetary system operates. So there are no MMT policies, there's an understanding. And then it's up to the political process to fight out the value systems. So I'm continually seeing on Twitter, oh, when we have MMT, everything's going to be hunky-dory. Well, go back to square one. Now, this is the complexity of MMT. And so you'll soon understand that just simple statements are not going to capture our work at all. And this is why it's an educative process, which is a slow burn process. So we start off with the money story. Warren mentioned it in the video. And this is a story about currency. What's a currency? What is it? What does it mean? What capacities does it bestow on the issuer of it? What constraints does it bestow on the user of it? Who are the users? Us. Who are the issuers? Our federal government in this case, in our case. And so the currency story, money story is about the way in which a currency can be used to shift resources from non-government sector to government sector to pursue socio-economic policies and the implications of that and whatever. That's what the money story is about. And as soon as we understand in the money story that our currency issuer is a monopoly, it's the only one that issues the currency, and as soon as we understand that the currency that we use are fiat currencies, they're not backed by any valuable commodity like gold or silver. As soon as we understand that, then the next implication that we understand is that, well, they can spend an infinite amount of that currency. Because we understand then that the way the government spends is just typing in numbers into bank accounts. And they can type any numbers they like, and that becomes currency. And so as soon as we get to the money story, we understand that a lot of what we've been told about the capacities of our federal government are complete myths. But then it raises the next question, well, if the currency issuer has this unlimited capacity to spend, does that mean it's not constrained at all? And so you see out there in the relatively recent attacks that have been going for last 12 or 18 months, that all we advocate is wild money printing and spending. Look at those idiots. Won't that be Zimbabwe? Well, that's go back to square one. And so once we get our head around the money story, we've got a resource story to tell. And this is where we start understanding what the actual constraints on the currency issue are, rather than the alleged financial constraints. And this is where we understand that a currency issuer can buy whatever's for sale in its own currency, whenever it wants to buy them, including all idle labour. And then we understand that unemployment then must be a political choice. It's not anything that's natural or market-driven, it's a political choice. If the government can buy all the idle labour, the narrative's getting more complex, it's getting more challenging for the mainstream. And of course, then the question is, well, what are these resource constraints? Well, the limits of available resources, of course. And what happens if all the available resources are being used and the government wants to increase the size of the government, that is, use more of the resources? Well, then we get into an inflation story. And there's a complex inflation story within MMT that relates to demand pressure, to calibrating bids for things in currency units relative to their availability or supply. There's a complex story about the distributional struggle within the non-government sector over the available real income, and so on and so forth. And so we need to make sure we understand all those arguments. And once we've got an inflation story, we then move into a stability framework story. And this is an acceptance that we want an efficient use of real resources. Oh, and going back to the resource story, by the way, we understand that if all the real productive resources, labour, capital, land, what have you, are being fully used at the current time, which then defines a current mix between public government and non-government sector. And if the government wants to expand its use of real resources, then what it has to do is deprive the non-government sector of those resources. And so there's a whole story about how, in MMT, about how the government, what capacity has the government got to deprive us of using those productive resources so it can expand its use of, and in other words, increase the size of government. It's quite a complex story, and it's not just as simple as saying, well, they tax us more, because a lot of the inflationary pressures don't come from the demand side. They come from administrative set prices. Like my health fund just went up crazy against the CPI. That's administrative setting. And so once we're in the stability framework, we're talking now about efficient use of resources, and that means getting the best out of the available resources. The best is defined depending on your set of values. I have a different concept of how to best use resources than one of my mainstream colleagues. And we then understand what one of the contributions that MMT has made from the inception is that there's only two ways in which you can get price stability in the economy, two broad ways. And these are expressions of what we call buffer stocks. Buffer stocks rise and fall with a cycle. And the buffer stocks that are available to a monetary system are unemployed buffer stocks, which mean that if you've got price pressures in the economy, the one way to discipline them and create stability is to create more unemployment by tightening fiscal and monetary policy settings, for example. Why does that stabilise prices? Because you discipline the workers' ability to increase prices and you kill the sales markets for firms, and that forces them not to push markups up in retaliation to workers trying to push their real wage demands back. And what MMT shows or argues is that way of achieving price stability surely works, but it's incredibly costly and it can't possibly be an efficient outcome. And so the other buffer stock is to have an employment buffer stock, and we call that the job guarantee. When I first started working on that in 1978 as a fourth-year student at University of Melbourne, I started calling it the BSE, buffer stock employment. And then in the 90s, when I met Warren and we started working on the project together, there was the mad cow disease in Britain, and that was the BSE, if you remember. That was what it was called. And I thought, well, we can't have my employment buffer stock as the mad cow disease. It was criticised enough as it was, so we decided that we'd call it job guarantee. The Americans, Randy and Warren, were calling it the employer of last resort, and I didn't think that was good. They thought that was a smart way of building on the lender of last resort from the central bank capacity, and my objection to that was that jobs are about humans, lender of last resort's about money, and we shouldn't commodify humans. So we all agreed in a very amicable way at that time to call it job guarantee. So that's the stability framework. Job guarantee isn't really a job creation program per se. And you heard in the video that the tension of, particularly in the current American debate, where all of the employment action is being summarised as we'll just need a job guarantee to get what I call a green transition going. Well, a job guarantee should be really tiny. And if you've got productive things in the public sector to do, just as Warren said, just create the work. The job guarantee is a buffer stock that goes up and down to make sure that we don't create an unemployment buffer stock when non-government spending fluctuates down. And it's just a small little pool, that's normally. Now, resource story also leads to a story about trade, and this is quite a complex story where we reverse the logic of mainstream and we consider exports to be a cost and imports to be a benefit. And a lot of people have really criticised us for this, and they talk about deindustrial effects in old manufacturing areas. How can we say that's good? Well, that's micro. We don't say it's bad, or we don't say it's good. We say that it's a separate issue. And in terms of, it's undeniable if you've got resources that the domestic population can use and you give them away to somebody else to use, well, then that's a cost. Now, why would you incur that cost? Well, because you want to get benefits via the things that you can, the foreign exchange that you can earn for those things, and to buy things that other people are willing to give. And if you can persuade the rest of the world to ship more real stuff to you than you're shipping back to them, well, then you're ahead. That's the MMT approach. It's not the mainstream approach. And the money story also takes us into the banking story, which is another complexity. And the banking story is about the fiscal dynamics, the way in which government spending and taxation impacts upon the financial system in ways that the mainstream have never captured properly and never really thought about. And so what do we get from that, as I'll explain in a moment? Well, we get completely the opposite type of outcomes. We get the knowledge that when the government runs a fiscal deficit, the dynamic it actually puts into the banking system is to push interest rates down, not up. We've been told that deficits push interest rates up. No, they don't. They put pressure on interest rates to go down. So the banking story is quite complex, and we're also told that if the government borrows from financial markets, it pushes interest rates up and crowds out productive private investment spending. Well, that's a supply-determined model of banking, which doesn't exist in the real world. The banking system is a demand-determined banking sector. And what I mean by that is that any credit-worthy borrower can go into a bank and borrow money, whether the bank's got reserves at that time or not. Banks aren't these little offices that get deposits to put in their vault and then lend them out when someone comes in to borrow. It works the opposite way. Banks don't have reserves necessarily. They lend, they create deposits, and then when those deposits become transactions through spending, well, then they worry about what the reserve implications are later. And if there's not enough reserves in the banking system, where do you think they get them from? The central bank. And this adds a nuance, because if you then think of simple heuristics that people repeat over and over again on Twitter trying to promote MMT, that the government's got to spend first before we can pay taxes, well, that's quite wrong once we add institutional reality, because we could go to borrow money from a bank and pay our taxes without the government spending at all. And so, but the nuance that expands as we add the complexity, once the simple heuristic gives way to institutional complexity, what we then learn is, well, ultimately we can do that. We can borrow money to pay our taxes without the government spending the currency into existence. But ultimately, if there's no reserves in the system, the central bank has to provide them. So ultimately, the currency's got to come from the government, but it's more complicated than that simple heuristic tells us. And of course, then we've got links between the capital market story, the external world, the foreign exchange system, the determination of exchange rates, and that's quite complex. And that feeds into the trade story through the capital account, and the banking story feeds into the trade story through forward contracts and speculation and what can be done if there's currency attacks, and that feeds into the stability framework. Now, you can't express that on Twitter, I'm sorry. And you can't learn that by reading a couple of blogs posts and then concluding you're an expert. This has taken years to develop. And so I urge everybody to be very patient and think about it as learning a new language, and to take your time on it, and to empower yourself each step of the way, each simple little baby steps, as we learn the language and the applications and stability on our feet and grammatical structure. It's going to take time, and we need to be very cautious, because what we're dealing with is a massive paradigmic war where the mainstream are not going to give in easy, and we need to be all really highly educated. All right, the money story briefly. There's no intrinsic financial constraint. That means that the government can buy anything that's available for its own currency. It chooses the unemployment rate, but it doesn't mean that the government can purchase unlimited quantities of goods without consequence, because of the resource story. And it also doesn't mean, and I've done a lot of work in developing countries, and I'm currently doing a lot of research on the West African currency and helping out with that struggle. the colonial currency. And people say to me, oh yeah, but you know, a less developed country, they're not going to be rich if they have their own currency. Well, of course they're not going to be, because what constrains them? Their availability of real resources. It's not the currency that's going to do it, it's they don't have enough to bring into productive use. But what their own currency means is that they can bring whatever they've got into productive use, which is sort of anti-IMF. This is what the current money story is about, the provisioning challenge. Government owns nothing. We own the productive resources, all those things that provide services and infrastructure support. And our challenge is to shift all of those things into the government sector so it can run its program. That's what a currency is about in terms of the government. The currency allows the government to do that. Now, why would we want this new currency, this bill that I've just brought in? See, that's a nice symbol, B. We've just introduced it. Why would anybody want that worth? And it's depicted as a piece of paper here, but it's really a digital currency, just numbers going into accounts. Why would anybody want that? It's not convertible into gold or silver or in any other currency as a guaranteed value. It's just a worthless token. Well, the way the money story tells us it works is that I announce as the government that everybody's got to come up with 100 Bs per period. Consequence of not, debtor's prison, loss of assets, whatever, tax dodger. And then you ask yourself the question, well, if I'm confronted with that problem, where do I get the Bs from? Well, the answer is I can solve that problem, I spend them. And I run my socio-economic program. And I employ people, I shift the resources in. So the currency allows for a provisioning of the government sector. Let's do some simple arithmetic. Before we do that, I want to make this point. So on Twitter you'll see taxes don't fund anything. Spending's got to come first. Well, that's true in one sense, that the tax revenue isn't necessary for the spending to take place, and the government can't collect the revenue until it's spent. In a simple world. We haven't got banking yet, we've just got the simple money story. But what legitimised the spending was the tax liability. Because the tax liability made a worthless currency immediately worth something. We had suddenly had a demand to get a requirement to get that currency. And so the tax liability comes first. And then the spending, and then the collection of the revenue. That's the sequence. Warren was talking about sequence. That's what we meant when we talk about sequence. So here's some simple arithmetic. Here's the government sector, non-government on the right-hand side for you and me. Above the fiscal injection overall savings lines are flows. These are flows of currency per period, and I've got years here, it doesn't matter. And below are stocks. Now, stocks are accumulations of currency. We sometimes call that wealth, but we also call it debt. And stocks are a response to flows. Flows go into and accumulate into stocks. And it's really important if you're learning macroeconomics to learn what these differences are and how stocks and flows have to be accounted for properly. Because what we know in mainstream economics is that it's not stock flow consistent. There's errors in the framework that they don't admit. All right, so here's 100. I'm employing 100 people in the non-government sector. I'm the government here. And so spending equals income. one sector's spending always has to equal the other sector's income. So I've got $100 in wage, that's employment. I've got people now working in the public sector doing stuff that we politically think will keep us in government and less cynically will advance human welfare. And now taxes are paid. And here's the causality. Bump, bump, bump. What drove the ability of me to spend that 100 was that my currency was legitimised by the tax liability. But what drove the ability of the non-government sector to pay those taxes was the fact that I spent it into existence and created employment in the public sector, in this case. And at the end of that first year, the fiscal injection is my superior language, because language and framing matters, is my superior language to what we wrongly call the fiscal deficit, budget deficit. I don't use that terminology because that applies to households, and households are users, the government's an issuer. So you've got to not frame using inappropriate metaphors. So the fiscal injection is just the difference between spending and taxation. It's zero. I'm running a balance. And look at the private non-government sector. Overall saving in the currency, zero. Year 2, I decide that I want more public sector activity, and so I up the employment to 120 bills, and I don't change the tax obligation. And so, once again, causality and the ongoing need of the non-government sector to get my currency because of the legal tax liability drives their willing to work, transfer their resources into the public sector and work for the government. And now in that second year, you'll all be able to do your simple arithmetic. The fiscal injection is now 20 bills because I've spent 120 and taxed 100. And look at the non-government sector now. It's got 20 bills that are currently untaxed, that's sitting there as saving. And so in the stock section here, they've now got financial wealth worth 20. What do you understand from that? You understand that the government deficit, exactly dollar for dollar in Australia's case, equals the non-government surplus. It's not an opinion, it's accounting. And the opposite would be the case. Now, year 3, I do the same thing. I maintain that particular fiscal injection. And in year 3, I've got a flow of 20 going in from the government sector. The saving in year 3 is 20, and that accumulates into the financial wealth of the non-government sector to be 40. So these two flows of 20 have accumulated into the stock of 40. Now, I might want to say, that 40 is currently earning no interest, and I might want to encourage further non-government thrift as the government for private risk management or whatever. And so I'll issue a bond, a government debt. And I'll say to the non-government sector, I will give you a bit of paper that says that you will give me X bills and you'll have this, it'll be my liability and I'll pay you back at some future time, but I'll pay you, say, 10% interest along the way. Okay? So everybody in this simple heuristic transfers their cash savings into bond savings. And now you see the stock for the government is 40 bills. That's public debt. Now, two things to think about. The public debt wasn't needed to fund the deficit. First point to understand. So we've all been led to believe the government borrows to allow it to spend more than its tax revenue. No, that's a lie. But the other thing to understand is that the ability of the non-government sector to buy that debt was because I didn't tax past deficits. The 40 that I used to buy, the non-government sector used to buy the government debt, was really just provided by the government. in the form of deficits in the past that I hadn't yet taxed away. If I had to run a fiscal balance, a fiscal injection equal to zero every period, there would be no stock of financial wealth that could be used to manage as a portfolio between cash and debt. It's completely the opposite to the way you've been taught to understand these things. And it has dramatically different implications. Okay, so then the IMF rings me up and says, you're on a hiding to nothing. Your government's going to go broke and all the rest of the nonsense. And so in year 4, I embark on my austerity, neoliberal austerity path, and I cut back government sector. You know, I'm going to get into surplus. I need the surplus. Both sides of government, both sides of the moronic political parties that we have in this country think that this is a good strategy. Well, look what happens. I cut back government employment and procurement contracts and all the rest of it, and I spend 76 is of wages, and the 4 is the 10% return on the outstanding debt. So the income into the non-government sector is a mixture of interest earning. Interest earning is a non-government sector income, and wages paid, but there's now unemployment in the non-government sector because I've cut back on government contracts and direct employment. But I haven't cut back the tax liability, and so in this case I'm still paying 100, but I'm only spending 80. Where does the non-government sector get the shortfall from? Its income for the year was 80, but it's having to pay me back 100. Well, it can only get it by liquidating its previous savings, by liquidating its wealth. It's not an opinion, it's accounting. And so and you see the fiscal injections now are negative 20, that's a surplus. That's what our government and our opposition think is the Shangri-La of our policy achievement. Yet what it's done is, look here, we've now only got 20 in the non-government sector. Our wealth has fallen by 20. What do you take from that? That fiscal surpluses destroy non-government sector wealth. So when our politicians say they're getting the debt monkey off our back, what they're really saying is that they're destroying our wealth. Okay. Now all of that's what I call a simple heuristic, just to get the money story working for you. And then, of course, as academic thinkers, we add more and more institutional complexity to that story. We introduce banks and what have you, and that then changes some of this. But the underlying principles remain broadly the same. And when we think about deficits, if the non-government sector has a desire to save in the currency overall, that means to spend less than it's earning in any particular year or period, well then the only way that can be funded in a monetary system using a fiat currency is if the government runs a deficit. It's not opinion, it's accounting. We can't save overall in any particular period if the government squeezes us for liquidity. It's impossible. I've already mentioned that national debt is just the accumulation of past deficits that haven't yet been taxed away. And a government, a currency issuer, can always meet its liabilities. There's no debt ratio that's too high, really. And then if you think about it one step further, the reason the governments issue debt is a legacy of the pre-1971 monetary system, the fixed exchange rate system, where the government had to use its fiscal policy in a consistent way with monetary policy, which was forced to maintain the exchange rate parities under the agreements. So the government couldn't pump too much money into the system because that currency into the system, because that would have forced the currency to devalue probably, depending on the trade side. So the government had to, if it wanted to run a deficit, had to drain currency out through debt issuance. After August 71, that system collapsed. President Nixon abandoned the gold convertibility. We floated in the 80s because we're a conservative nation and stupid as a consequence. We took 15 years to do it. Like everything, we run behind the rest of the world. And if you think about that, the need to issue bonds to match deficits is gone. There's no need for the government to issue bonds, and the government should stop issuing bonds. And the MMT, Warren talked about purist MMT position, and with some arrogance, I define that as what Warren and I are thinking. We argue you shouldn't issue bonds at all. And if you think back to early 2000s, when Costello was running all those surpluses, and was not reissuing retiring debt as it matured, he didn't reissue it, which is the standard practice. What happened was that the government bond market started to get very thin. What that means is there weren't much bonds to sell and trade. Who do you think complained about that? Well, the Sydney Futures Exchange, the Commonwealth Bank, and all the rest of these speculators. And the government had an inquiry. I gave expert witness with Warren, and we were the only ones saying that the issuing of this debt was corporate welfare, that it was unnecessary. They were complaining because they wanted a risk-free asset to park their funds when they were feeling insecure about the market in general. And it gave them massive welfare benefits to be able to ease their insecurities about their speculative positions. What Costello and the government decided was to keep issuing debt, even though they were running surpluses, which blew their cover as to what the debt was actually meant to be doing. But a progressive should never advocate the government continue to issue debt, and that's the MMT position. What's the appropriate fiscal position? The appropriate fiscal position is that when the non-government has made all of its spending and savings decisions, autonomously, individually, all adding up to the macro, then if the total spending in the economy isn't sufficient to generate sales that would fully employ all the available workforce, well, there's only one other sector that can step in, and that's the government sector. And so if when we're thinking about what size deficit should be, then it's the context that matters. A deficit's not good or bad. They're the sort of terms that are used by my profession because they masquerade science as scientists, but they're just moralists. There's no good or bad per se. It all depends upon context. And so if the non-government sector spending is insufficient to fully employ everybody, well then the government has to run a deficit. And if you like Norway, with massive North Sea energy revenue coming in from the external sector, such that they can have lots of revenue coming in, still provide first-class government services, and still provide for the non-government's private domestic sector being able to save to their desires, well then they might have to run a surplus to avoid the resource constraint, the inflation pressures. Context really matters. We can't. A 4% deficit is not worse than a 2% deficit, and it's not better than a 3% surplus. It all depends, and the MMT makes that absolutely clear. You have to look into the detailed circumstances of the sectors. The inflation story, briefly, and we go into great detail on this. All spending carries an inflation risk. whether it's government spending, whether it's export revenue coming in, whether it's private business investment and capital formation, whether it's household consumption spending. There's nothing unique about government spending that makes it more inflationary than our household consumption spending. And it all depends upon the bids that are being made in the market, and in the longer video you'll hear Warren and I talk about this in detail, that it all depends upon the bids relative to what's available to accept those bids. And if those bids are bidding up prices and offering spending at rising prices relative to the ability of the economy to meet that nominal spending growth with real production of goods and services, then there'll be inflation. But running a deficit is not inflationary per se if it satisfies that condition I mentioned previously, that fills the spending gap left by the desire of the non-government sector to save overall. You can have continuous deficits until the end of existence and not be inflationary, if it's appropriately in the context of what the non-government sector is doing, and that means the private domestic sector and the external sector. The stability framework story. And as I said in just introducing that little box, there's only two buffer stock options available in a monetary system. You can either create unemployment and discipline the price process, or you can create an employment buffer stock. And the one thing that we agree with mainstream economics, even though I said it was fake knowledge at the beginning, all of it, is that as macroeconomists, we probably concur that efficiency is a desirable objective. Now, what's efficiency? Well, it's using your resources, not wasting your productive resources. It's using them in their best use. Now, where we disagree is what defines best use. But that's nuance in this context. It's very important generally, but nuance in this point. And so any buffer stock that wants to... So if the goals are to have price stability, and what that means is you want stable inflation, because inflation is problematic in terms of contractual certainty and a whole range of other things. It's not as problematic as unemployment, of course, but... So you want to have a framework that delivers price stability, but also delivers efficiency of resource use at the macro level. And so you've got these two buffer stock options, and the way in which you appraise those buffer stock options is to ask yourself, will it deliver price stability? Will it be efficient? Now, it's not rocket science to know that if you're going to discipline the price system by forcing people into unemployment so workers are less keen to push for wage increases, or have less to spend and push up demand pressures in the sales markets, and because the workers are losing their income and not spending much, the firms are not going to be as willing to defend margins as vigorously as they did previously, profit margins. That's going to surely work. And what wiped out inflation in Australia was the 1991 recession. The inflation that came in the 70s from the OPEC oil crisis, where oil prices, massively rose around the world. What finally killed that was the massive unemployment in Keating's neoliberal recession we had to have. More on. But the costs of unemployment are massive. Even if you're just a bean counter, the daily losses of national income for having people not working are in the millions. But then you add in all of the costs to the individuals. So that's a systemic loss. But you add the losses to the individual, the pathologies that emerge, the shrinking of social networks, the increased alcohol and substance abuse, the breakdown of families, the increased participation in the legal system, the loss of identity, higher suicide rates, and all the rest of it. It couldn't possibly be a desirable way to achieve price stability because you're not achieving efficiency. And so the MMT approach, and I came to this during fourth year at Melbourne University. I was studying agricultural economics on a cold winter day and staring at Royal Parade in Carlton. And we were studying the wool stabilisation scheme that the Australian government ran. And briefly, that was a scheme. It was a sop to the farming community, the wool pastoralists, who wanted a stable income because of the variation in the wool clip would deliver massive shifts in their income. So they persuaded the government to create this buffer stock scheme that would stabilise their income. And what it meant was if there was too much, so they agreed on a level of a price level, and what the government would do is if there was too much wool put in the market on a particular year that would drive the price down, who bought all the wool? The government would build the wool, buy the wool. And for those as old as I am, you'll remember those big red brick buildings that are now gentrified, cosmo-urban, woke left apartments. Well, they were wool stores. And if the clip was bad in one year, which would have the effect of driving the price up, the government would sell it back out of the wool stores, the buffer stock, and stabilise the price. Demand and supply mechanism. That's what a buffer stock is. It's a stock that varies with the cycle to stabilise a price. And I wasn't very interested in wool, but I was really interested in unemployment because at that time in the late 70s, Australia moved out of full employment. And so I wrote my thesis that year on what I called the buffer stock employment model, which is now the MMT job guarantee model. And what that says is you can have full employment of wool, you can have full employment of labour. You can, if there's a shortage of demand for labour in the economy, which would create an excess supply, well then the government can always absorb that excess supply in productive work in the public sector, always. And if the non-government sector starts to grow again and need labour, it can just buy it out of the buffer stock. And that then leads us to say that the buffer stock has to be a fixed wage, below the relative wage structure of the private sector. Because, and this is really important, because you want to have the government hiring off the bottom, not putting bids into the market for resources that will compete with the non-government sector. And so you set, and I've done work in say South Africa on setting a minimum wage framework for them. And the argument I used there was that when you're setting a minimum wage, it's not a capacity to pay argument that's relevant, it's the sophistication of the society that you're aiming for. The minimum wage is what you believe in a moral sense, and a value sense is the minimum you want workers to get per hour. So a government sets that to be socially inclusive, and that means that you can go to the theatre occasionally, you can go out to a cafe, you can sort of mix it with the woke left. And go to the football, go to concerts, whatever. That's social inclusion. So the minimum wage isn't some ridiculous low wage. It's a socially inclusive wage. But once you set that, and that becomes the fixed price at which the government's going to buy the excess supply of labour if the non-government sector spending goes down, well then the government sticks to that and then buys that at that fixed price. And of course, then if the non-government sector wants to expand and buy labour, it just has to buy it at a slightly higher price out of the job guarantee pool. And that process can't possibly be inflationary because you're buying at a fixed bid for resources that have zero bid in the private market. That's why they're unemployed. Nobody wants them. So that's a price stability framework that is also achieves as close to possible efficiency as we can. Now, I know all the arguments about, oh yeah, but what happened, people get up in the audience and say, oh yeah, but you wouldn't go into you wouldn't go into the job guarantee pool because it'd be below your skill set or anything. Well, they don't want to underestimate me because I probably would. But the point is that it has to be inclusive to everybody. And there will clearly be workers with skills that in the private market that can earn higher wages when demand for labour is higher. But one of the things we know about the private market is that when there's a downturn in the cycle, most skilled labour has redundancy packages which bide them over in the unemployment period, as long as unemployment's not too long. So they won't go into the job guarantee because they've got enough to bide them over. And it's called wait unemployment. And the other thing that I read a lot, especially, and progressives say, well, why don't we have a wage structure in the job guarantee? Why don't we make it fair? And so as a professor, I'm earning heaps. Why wouldn't you get paid heaps in the job guarantee? And why would a cleaner not get paid the minimum? Well, as a value statement, the cleaners are the most important workers in the society and should be paid much more than professors. But that's beside the point. Well, they save us from infection and national disease, but that's a different point. The point is that it has to be a fixed bid at the bottom end of the market to be a price anchor. And if you want to have all these progressive, hard on the sleeve approaches to equity, well then employ the people in the public sector, not in the buffer stock. All right, we'll close pretty soon. And this is a really important thing. What the job guarantee allows us to do, in my opinion, is to have a national debate about what is meaningful work and about what is productive work. Now, a lot of the UBIs, the Universal Basic Income, they reject the whole notion of work. But all the evidence is that we, as a society, value people working. Now, when we go back to the Great Depression, the concept of the gainful worker was brought into the literature. And the gainful worker framework was that you were gainfully employed if you were doing jobs that would add profit to the private sector. And so a whole range of other really valuable, socially useful things are considered not gainful, are considered to be unproductive. And so that's why when I say, well, pushing out the limits of our imagination, I would have surfers at Newcastle Beach employed in the job guarantee. Oh, but that's not productive. Well, what's the problem in summer in Australia? People drowning on our beaches. Who actually knows the beaches better than anyone? Who actually jumps in the rips to get out to the break quicker? The surfers. So as part of the job guarantee, sure, they can go and surf, but they can also conduct water safety classes and water intelligence classes for school kids every day. That's hugely productive. And in a bean counter sense, it's going to save heaps in lost lives. And so you just can think more and more of this. The job guarantee allows us to have a dialogue about how we can shift our thinking towards productivity and meaningful interaction with each other in the labour market. And I don't like income guarantees, and I don't think any progressive should advocate income guarantees for the following three reasons. One, you're buying immediately into the neoliberal argument that the unemployment is unavoidable and the government can't do anything about it other than to create a consumption unit, construct the unemployed human as a consumption unit and give them a dollop of money to shut them up. Well, if you're an MMTer, you know that the government can always do something about it by creating jobs themselves or stimulating jobs in the non-government sector. So why buy into the neoliberal myth that we can't do anything about unemployment? And the solution is a lateral one. The second reason is that it constructs the whole debate in individualistic terms, that you're powerless and we need to look after you as an individual. Because unemployment is a systemic problem. It's a failure of the system. It's a failure of spending to be sufficient to fully employ people. And that arises because, given the non-government sector spending and saving decisions, the government's not spending enough. If there's mass unemployment, the deficit's too low. It's not an opinion, it's absolute fact. And so once you start trying to find individualistic solutions, you then open the debate up to all sorts of pretty unsavoury debates about, well, that person's really unemployed because they can't be stuffed working, or they're lazy, or they haven't made the right choices in life. The reason they're unemployed is because there's not enough jobs, and there's not enough jobs because there's not enough spending, and there's not enough spending because the government deficit's too low. That's the fact. And the third reason is that I've gained massively in my life from being employed. Not just income, but self-esteem, a sense of purpose, a sense of contributing to something. The bonhomie of morning teas talking about how the Melbourne Footy Club's the best footy club in the country. Someone put on, I put my photo up yesterday because I had a mask on going for a run in Newcastle because the smoke is so bad, and I had my Melbourne Footy Club cap on, stop the sun, and someone said, oh yeah, it's obvious why you've got to wear a mask. You're embarrassed about your football club. Probably an Adelaide supporter. And so the point being made is, if you just treat people as a consumption unit, that the only problem the government's got to address with respect to that person is to keep them at a minimum level of survival with a UBI, and you think that they'll become massively creative as a consequence, well, then you're denying the social aspects of work, the continuity and the collectivity of work, and that's really important. Okay, so I think, as I said, it's complex. There's lots of stories, the banking story. And the last thing, this is just a little framework to reinforce everything I've just said. It takes about 3 minutes. Here's a matrix. And up here we've got a question. Does the nation enjoy monetary sovereignty? What that means is, does the government issue its own currency? Does it float it on foreign exchange markets? And does the central bank set its own interest rate? And it doesn't borrow in any foreign currency. That's what monetary sovereignty means. There's no real degrees of that once you define that. I keep reading on Twitter that there's a continuum of money sovereignty. Well, no, there's not. And have you got a real resource constraint or not? Is the economy fully employed? So here's the MMT story. Yes, yes. What are the constraints on government spending? They're real constraints. That's the constraint story. What constrains government spending when you've got full employment and you issue your own currency is the available resources. And if you want to spend more, and you've got to make sure the non-government sector has the capacity to spend less. So you've got to have a story about how you do that. Second choice, in that context there are no constraints on government spending, and the deficit should increase until full employment, until you go back to this cell. Now, it's not science, it's art, and it's not precise. What happens if you don't have monetary sovereignty? Who doesn't have monetary sovereignty? Germany, the 19 member states of the euro, any government that pegs its currency like Denmark, the CFA franc countries in West Africa, they don't enjoy monetary sovereignty. What are their constraints for government spending? Well, if the economy's at full employment, they've got financial constraints and real constraints. They've got to fund their deficits and they can't continue to spend without hitting the inflation barrier. And in this case, they've still got financial constraints because they don't enjoy sovereignty, so they're dependent upon the bond markets to fund deficits. Okay? Here's the mainstream story. This is the only time I'm going to refer particularly to mainstream, so you see very clearly the difference. In mainstream economics, there's no relevant distinction as to whether you have monetary sovereignty or not. So you'll see heaps of papers where they compare Japan to Greece. And they believe that all deficits have to be funded through debt issuance because they believe wrongly that the government is like a household. Households, they don't understand the difference between an issuer and a user of the currency. And so in this case, what are the constraints on government spending? They're financial, always financial and real, and always financial. And that's a massive difference in perception. And that changes the fiscal space that we can conceive our governments can use to advantage well-being in the economy. And that's the way in which MMT has departed from the mainstream. It expands the fiscal space that's available to us to then politically fight over. And I think that's end. Thank you.
So afternoon tea is about 3:15, and so we have just under 10 minutes of time for questions. So there's microphones coming towards you. So I think, yeah, is it Bernard? Yeah. Okay.
Maybe I'm loud enough.
No.
Okay. Right. No, my question's a little bit about what is full employment in the sense of 5 days a week, 4 days a week, 3 days. Who's to decide? Because many years ago, I remember there was a sort of goal and aspiration that given our productive potential, we don't all have to be at the wheel 5 days a week, 40 hours or whatever. We can bring that back down, which raises, of course, the additional question, what's the purpose of the time we are not working and how do we develop that? But how would that impact the considerations within what you've talked about in the job guarantee?
Okay, you want to do them? Apparently there's a camera. Just do my tie up. And I have more than one tie, by the way. I noticed I was wearing this tie in the video. I'll wear it tomorrow, I assure you, just to prove it. Look, it's not for me to define full employment in some sort of fixed way. What we know is that there's currently 9% of people underemployed who on average want about 15.4 hours extra a week. It's about 1.3 million people. So they're clearly wanting to work more. They're signalling that in to the national statistician. So they've got to be absorbed before you've got full employment. And the point I'm making is that they're signalling their intention to work and how much extra work they want. We also have about 738, something like that, unemployed. who signal how much extra work they want, whether it be part-time or full-time. We can add that up into terms of full-time equivalents, simple arithmetic. That tells you how much extra work is required. And we also have participation rates, that's people who are of working age, who are neither working nor unemployed, who want to be working or unemployed but have given up looking, so the statistician says they're no longer in the labour force. They're what we call hidden unemployed. Well, we sort of know how many there are of them. We've got a rough idea of the extra hours they want to work because they probably reflect the same preferences of the unemployed. So just add up your sums. So at any given time, that's what full employment is. It's probably around 2% unemployment, not 5.5%. It's probably zero. It's not probably. It is zero underemployment, 1.3 million, and its participation rates at your cyclical potential. It's probably about 1.4% of the current labour force at the moment. That's full employment. And the way I think about it, if you want to test that, offer a job guarantee and see how many people turn up for work. Then you'll see how many jobs have to be created. Yeah?
Hi, I'm Jane. Bill, I just want to thank you. I'm a local government councillor and we've got upcoming budget discussions, so I'm going to look at it in a more productive lens, and our mayor is here today as well. My question is, why has Germany chosen not to have financial sovereignty? I don't know if that's an appropriate question, but it just seemed a surprise because it's often held up as a very good economy to lay people. So is there an easy answer?
How much time have we got? In 2015, I wrote a 512-page book on it. Look, the European situation is quite complicated. It's a very confused mix of sort of political ambitions relating to vestiges of their military history over many years and morphing into a sort of dominance of neoliberalism and a corporate sort of neoliberal takeover, but it's not, I can't really talk about it in, they're mad.
I've just got a quick question about the employment buffer stock. I'm not sure if I understood it correctly. Does it produce price stability because it produces wage stability?
It produces price stability because if you have inflationary pressures in the economy, you can either transfer workers into the unemployed pool by tightening up your policy settings, or you can transfer them into the employment pool. So the mechanisms of disciplining the private inflationary process have a similar intent. It's just that in one sense you make people unemployed, in the other you create productive work. And the point is that you're buying labour at a fixed price from a sector that's inflating in prices. So if you're redistributing workers from an inflating sector to a fixed price sector, you eventually stop the inflation. Now, and I want to make it absolutely clear that the job guarantee is just a really small part of what a progressive government should be doing. It's not the solution to everything, and as I'll speak tomorrow about green transition, it's a tiny part of the future challenge. It's just a safety net, a productive safety net. That's all it is. We don't want to, shouldn't, as MMTs, we shouldn't expect the job guarantee to do too much work for us in solving the problem. Small little thing. As Warren said, it's a little buffer stock. Smaller the better.
Yeah.
Sorry, this first lady up the back there.
Okay.
Bill, terrific talk. In talking about the job guarantee, I was also wondering if you've got thoughts about a nutritional floor, such as a number of poor countries have introduced, and in a weird way the United States does with its subsidy of corn. But our big failure of our economy at the moment is actually rural, and climate change profoundly endangers our food supplies. So we're going to have a massive reconstruction of our food industries to make them have some resilience against climate change. Is it feasible on the sort of model or similar to the wool price guarantee, and I know there was the wheat board as well, but is there a way we could have a nutritional floor that enables farming, and particularly the growing of vegetables and fruit, to be viable, which they aren't at the moment?
Well, look, I'm a macroeconomist, and I know very little about those things. I do know that these sort of things can be manipulated. I'm reminded of what happened under Ruth Richardson in New Zealand. If some New Zealanders in the audience, you'll know what I'm talking about. They decided that they needed to cut welfare benefits to pursue surpluses, and they hired a nutritionist to come up with the minimum nutrition a human needed to stay alive, and they would then calibrate the pension according to that. And then when it went to Cabinet, she ordered the department to reduce that by 20%. Yeah, serious. And during that era of New Zealand government, and by the way, the Labor government were just as bad in New Zealand, but as they are most places. But during that period, New Zealand as an advanced country started to get rickets in their children, vitamin deficiencies. So, you know, I don't know much about nutrition other than that. I don't think it's up to the government to start setting minimum nutrition standards. But I think that, yeah, well, you'd have to speak to an agrarian economist about that. I really don't know. I think everybody should become vegetarian and stop clearing as much land. I think we've got to bring back... Tomorrow I'll announce a new coalition that I'm part of that I think will be really quite exciting. And part of that agenda will be food sustainability and food security. And I'm part of the coalition. My partners know much more about all that stuff than I do.
One more question.
Yeah.
Jeff.
Yeah.
Hi. You call it modern money theory.
No, I call it modern monetary theory.
Okay, modern monetary theory. It sounds to the uninitiated like the latest harebrained ideology that you want to impose upon the world, but it seems to me that what it really is a description, not a theory, and I would call it modern money practice or something, and I wonder if you agree with that or why you call it a theory, because it seemed to me it would be more easily, people would be more easily educated if it didn't sound like some harebrained crazy new notion.
Well, for people that operate in the Twitter universe, they might want to be lied to, I don't know. But this is an academic discipline we've created. This is a knowledge set, a body of work. And for example, remember I talked about context. Well, what is the context? Well, it's household spending, it's private business capital formation, it's export spending. Governments have to be continually modelling and understanding that. Well, what does that depend upon? It's not description. We've got to introduce behavioural knowledge to describe why households spend. Does households spend consumption expenditure because the sun's up 3 hours a day? Or is it because they get income? What does savings depend upon? What does the exchange rate depend upon? What does the terms of trade? What drives that? What drives business capital formation? What drives gross and net investment? got to have theories about that. You've got to have behavioural theories. MMT certainly has descriptive elements. It has accounting elements, but it also has behavioural theory in it. And it's absolutely necessary to have that. Otherwise, you can't say anything about causality. How do we know how the non-government sector is going to react to deficit spending from the government? What conclusions are you going to draw from that knowledge? Well, you have to understand the behaviour of the sectors to understand what the outcomes are likely to be. Otherwise, you're nowhere. So that's why it's called modern monetary theory. It's modern because there's a lot of modern elements to it. In particular, it works in an economy post-1971. It's monetary because it's about the monetary system, and it has theoretical components to provide context and understanding. It's understanding. You need behavioural theories to understand something.
Okay. So we're wrapping up now. Sorry, there's no more time for questions. We're going to go now to afternoon tea. So, yep.
Yeah, as a good friend of mine, Tori, said the other day, there's nothing quite as practical as a good theory.